Well, good morning. This is Barry Odell with the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page, and it is Tuesday morning, May 10th, 2022, and we're ready for 1 Corinthians chapter 10 today. Good to see you on here. Gail, Brian, Linda, Sheila, good to see you guys and others who are watching. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, use the comment section, and I will acknowledge those when I see them. Lyle, good to see you. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 is where we are. There are usually a couple of verses that are referenced in this chapter, primarily. Two of them are verses 6 and 11, and those verses are usually referenced when we're talking about maybe like an Old Testament passage, and we say something along the lines of, well, we know we're not under the old law, but the old law was given as an example for us to follow, and that's true. And that's exactly what Paul's doing here. But then a third verse that's also referenced in, I would say most frequently out of this chapter, is verse 13. There is no temptation taken you but such as is common to man, but God is faithful, who will not permit you to be tempted above what you are able, but will with that temptation also make a way of escape that you may be able to bear it. Gail wants to know if she's the only one without sound. Hey, Barry and Glenda. From my end, from here at the office, it looks like you should have sound. So, I don't know. I guess we'll wait and see what everybody else says. Okay, Sheila says it sounds good. All right. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. So we got to back up a little bit, pick up where we are. Thanks, Sheila. Thank you, Linda. 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Just because you have the right to do something doesn't mean that you should do it. You've got to be aware of the conscience of others and your own. Hey, Wayne, good to see you. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul illustrates what that meant by using himself as an example. I had every right to be supported by you financially as a congregation. He who preaches the gospel should live of the gospel, but I didn't take advantage of that right. So people were looking at Paul and they were saying, well, because he didn't take money, there must be something wrong with his apostleship. But had he taken money, people would have looked at him and said, well, there must be something wrong with his apostleship. And so in the case of Corinth, he decided to leave it alone. He was a tent maker. He got together with Aquila and Priscilla, and they worked with their own hands and provided their own needs there, or he did anyway, in the city of Corinth. And so then and in the rest of chapter 9, so that really goes down through verse 18 of 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and then from verses 19 to 27, he talks about his own conduct and about the fact that he controlled himself, brought himself under control, could adapt himself to any situation, whether it was to a Jewish person or to a person of non-Jewish descent. Hey, Michelle, good to see you. He controlled himself in every situation, and he didn't do things just because he could or just because he had the right to do them. And he said, I have to subject my body and bring it under control, lest I myself should become a castaway. I think the King James uses the word castaway. The New King James uses the word disqualified, and I looked up that Greek word that means disapproved or unapproved. A child of God can conduct himself in such a way as to become, so as to lose his salvation. It's precisely what Paul says here. And so then you open your Bible to chapter 10, and in most of your English versions, the first word will be something like moreover. Okay, so I'm looking at the New King James. He's made that point in verse 27. I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. So then we get to chapter 10. He just continues the thought. Moreover, brethren. Okay, so now he's going to use another example of what that looks like, of controlling oneself, or in this case, what it looks like when one does not control him or herself. So we'll get started here. We've got several others who have joined on. Michelle, Barbara, Connie, Lottie, good to see all of you guys on here today. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware. Something you're going to notice here in these first 4 verses of 1 Corinthians 10 is he repeats this word all. He uses Israel from the Old Testament, and particularly their wilderness, the wilderness wandering, and the events that took place there. And he incorporates every one of them. Okay, so just pay attention to this word all here. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all of our fathers were under the cloud. All passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate of the same spiritual food, and all drank of the same spiritual drink. For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. So I wanted to read those first 4 verses because Paul makes that point rather emphatically, that every person who escaped from Egyptian captivity, recorded there beginning in Exodus chapter 12 on into Exodus chapter 15 when they are able to cross the Red Sea and all of that, every one of them escaped Egypt, and every one of them were partakers of the benefits that God showered upon them throughout that time. Okay? That's important because he's making a point here to the church at Corinth within the larger context of how you control yourself and how you behave yourself. Again, going all the way back into chapter 8. The experience of Israel, one of the points he's making here in 1 Corinthians 10, the experiences that Israel had in the wilderness should show the Christian today, and that's the point of verses 6 and 11 here in chapter 10, that it is possible, while being one of God's people, which that's what the Israelites were, that's what the church is, you can conduct yourself in such a way so as to pull yourself out of that status. You know, there are a lot of examples of that. I think of the preaching, for instance, the preaching of John the Baptizer when he was preaching to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, Matthew chapter 3, Luke chapter 3, to all those Jewish people who came out of the cities into the wilderness to hear him preach. And his message was essentially the same thing that we're reading right here. You're related to Abraham. God can from these stones raise up children to Abraham. Don't rely on your position. Let's say it that way. You're a Jewish person. Great. So what? That doesn't matter. You have to bring forth fruits worthy of repentance. That's kind of the same thing we're dealing with here. All Israel experienced all these blessings. And he points that out in the first 5 verses, even down to the food that they ate and the water that they drank. Now the question often comes up, well, what does that mean that the spiritual rock that followed them and that rock was Christ? So let's talk about that for just a minute. They ate of the same spiritual food. This goes back to Exodus chapter 16, Exodus chapter 17, and drank of the same spiritual drink. Well, all we're talking about here in regard to those things is the supernatural supply of food and water. They didn't provide food, the manna that came from heaven. In fact, Moses didn't even provide the manna that came from heaven. God did that. And the water's the same way. Speak to the rock. Water gushed forth and they drank. So when you read that in 1 Corinthians 10, 3 and 4, they ate of the same spiritual food and the same spiritual drink. The source of that was divine. And you might consider that there with the phrase, the spiritual rock was Christ. It was all supernatural supply. They didn't provide it of themselves. And they all got to experience that, the provision of God. Not just the food and the drink, but I can't think of the passage right now, but it talks about the fact that their shoes didn't wear out, their feet didn't swell, their clothes didn't wear out. They were in the wilderness for 40 years. That was what we would call a supernatural intervention. That was miraculous. And so in their wilderness events, they had the supernatural supply of food, the supernatural supply of water. They all partook of that. They were all part of that group of people who were delivered by the hand of Moses out of Egyptian captivity. But here's his point. Here's the larger point that he's making here. Verse 5. But with most of them, God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. And then what he does in from verses 7 through 10 is he told the Corinthians, and we read it today, what that looked like, their bodies being scattered throughout the wilderness. Now remember the context in which this is written. Why is he writing this? Well, because all the way back in 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 24, he says to them of their Christian life, run it in such a way that you may obtain the prize. He uses himself as an example of being self-disciplined and temperate and self-controlled, lest he becomes disqualified, and then he goes directly to the Corinthians. Let's take Israel for an example. What did they learn from their experiences, and then what can we learn from their experiences? And that's verse verses 1 through 4, they all had the benefits. Verse 5, but, and then verse 6. Now these things became our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. So as we go through this section here, from verses 7 through 10, I'll give you the scripture references to the Old Testament. So verse 7, and do not become idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Right maybe next to that verse, Exodus 32. That's what he's talking about. When Moses went up in the mountain, he was gone, and Aaron built the golden calf. That's Exodus chapter 32. And these are the people whom God delivered and provided the spiritual food, the supernatural supply of food, the supernatural supply of water. Real quick, let's jump back to 1 Corinthians 10, verse 1 and 2. They were all under the cloud. You know, the cloud, you remember, they had a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, and that represented God's presence and God's direction. When those pillars either stood still, the children of Israel camped. When they started to move, the children of Israel moved. They had God's directives, and in a very obvious manner, visible. They all passed through the sea. Well, that's the idea of God's deliverance. You have God's presence in the cloud, you have God's deliverance in the sea, and then they were all baptized unto Moses, and that's the idea of leadership. And that's interesting when you connect, they were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. You know, when they crossed through the Red Sea, as recorded there in, Exodus 14 and 15? I think it's something like that. They're surrounded, okay? They're walking on the ground. The sea has split, and so they've got walls of water on each side, and then clouds above. They were completely submerged in the leadership of Moses. Now, you parallel that with the baptism into the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in Matthew 28:19. I'm not saying that what happened there is symbolic of baptism, but it's a type. It represents that they were immersed into the leadership of Moses as they went through the sea. Well, when you are baptized into Christ, you are immersed into a relationship with Him. He is now your leader, let's say. You're baptized into His name. That same thing happened to all of Israel. And yet, with all of them, with many of them, God was not well pleased. And so they were scattered in the wilderness. Exodus 32 illustrates that. Verse 8, nor let us commit fornication, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. Verse 8, that goes back to Numbers chapter 25. Okay, if you're writing these down. Verse 9, nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. That goes back to Numbers chapter 21. I mean, you can trace this out historically in those books of the wilderness wanderings. Nor complain, as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. I'm having all kinds of trouble with allergies. You can probably tell from my voice. But anyway, verse 10, I did this one time, and I've actually got it written in the margins of my Bible. When you start reading the deliverance, beginning in Exodus chapter 12, it doesn't take many chapters. And for them, it didn't take many days. Okay, they've been in Egypt for 400 years. And it's a matter of days after their deliverance before they start complaining. So when you look at verse 10 here in 1 Corinthians 10, I mean, that starts in Exodus and goes all the way through the book of Numbers. There were constant complaints. So Paul's drawing a lesson here. He controlled himself, chapter 9, because he could have become disqualified. Israel did not control themselves in the wilderness, and they did become disqualified. God was not well pleased with them, and their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. And you know, the ultimate end of that really was Numbers chapters 13 and 14, where the 12 spies were sent into the land. 10 of the spies came back and said, the land is everything you said it would be, but we can't do it. They have walled cities. The people there are massive, and we're scared of them. We cannot take the land. And it was at that point where, okay, for 40 years, you're going to wander 1 year for every day you were in the promised land. spying it out. So they spent 40 years in the wilderness, and Joshua and Caleb were the only two permitted, and those under, those under the age of 20, am I thinking about that correctly, who were permitted to enter the promised land. That entire generation perished in the desert because God was not pleased with them. And again, all of those people who perished, they were under the cloud. They passed through the sea. They were baptized into Moses. They all had the same spiritual food and spiritual drink. But they fell. Paul had to control himself because he said, if I don't, I'll become a castaway. 1 Corinthians 9:24. And that's the point he's making to the Israelite, or rather to the Corinthians. He says that in verse 6, and then he says it again here in verse 11. Now all these things happened unto them as examples, and they were written for our admonition. You know, an admonition is encouragement with warning. Be faithful. Watch your step. Because here's what happened to Israel. They happened for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Well, what does that mean? I know the King James says the end of the world has come. The end of the ages has come. We are in what's called the church age, the Christian age, the final dispensation of time before the judgment. This is it. And when this age is over, whenever that may be, whenever the Lord decides to end it, it's heaven or hell. And so we have to be prepared for that, and don't let ourselves, don't let your guard down, let's say. So then he says this, therefore, verse 12, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. You better be careful. You cannot, and again, this goes all the way back to chapter 8. You cannot conduct yourself any way that you want to conduct yourself just because you have a right to do so. And so many people have that mindset. And Paul says you better watch out. If that's the way you think, and this is what 1 Corinthians 10:12 means, if that's the way you think, then you are in fact in danger of falling. Verse 12 does not mean that you doubt your salvation, okay? It doesn't mean that if you're faithful and you're walking in the light and you're doing God's will, that you should always think, oh no, am I lost? That's not what he's saying here. It's in that broader context of one's personal behavior and their, basically their willingness to do whatever they want to do. So if you think if that's your stance, you better watch out. Because Israel really had that same attitude. Hey, we're God's people. We've been delivered from Egypt. We can do whatever we want to do. Well, with many of them, God was not well pleased, and he scattered their bodies in the wilderness. So then we have verse 13. Very misused verse. So let's read it, and then we'll look at it. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man, but God is faithful. So one of the ways I've heard this passage interpreted is, God doesn't give you more than you can handle. 1 Corinthians 10:13 says God doesn't give you more than you can handle. That's not what 1 Corinthians 10:13 says. That's not what it's talking about. This word for temptation here, typically in the New Testament, is dealing with external sources of trial, external sources of difficulty, whatever that may be. There's no temptation that you've experienced except what is common to man. Okay, whatever you go through, somebody else has been there. That was true with Paul. That was true with the Corinthians. That's true with us. A lot of times we're very good at self-pity and isolating ourselves and thinking that our situation is somehow unique. It's not. We're not special. God hasn't specifically and specially picked me out to work me over. That's not how it works. If you're going through something, somebody else has already been there. It's common to man. Here's what the point is. God is faithful. See, Israel didn't stay faithful, and that's what he talked about earlier in the chapter. Paul stayed faithful. He talked about that back in chapter 9. God is always faithful, and he will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. That doesn't say he doesn't give you more than you can bear. Does God tempt us to sin? Well, no, because James chapter 1 says that he doesn't tempt he cannot be tempted with evil, neither does he tempt any man. So we know it can't be talking about that. What are we going through in life? What are the difficulties and challenges we're facing? He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, But with the temptation, there it is, whatever the temptation may be, whatever you're going through. See, Israel could have overcome their idolatry. They could have overcome the temptation to fornicate, verse 8. They didn't have to complain, verse 10. They chose to do all those things. God will make a way of escape that you may be able to bear it. He will provide a way of escape that you may be able to bear it. You know, the Bible tells us to flee the devil, and he will, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. James chapter 4, I think that's verse 7. You don't have to give in to temptation. You don't have to do like Israel did and give in to all of your desires and do what you want to do because you feel you have the right to do them. You know, you think about that because, again, I connect this back with chapter 8. You cannot conduct yourself because you say, well, I have the right to do that. That's not how the Christian conducts themselves. At least they shouldn't. So think about Israel. When Moses went up into the mountain, he's gone for a period of time, and they think, well, he's dead. What do we do now? Well, let's make ourselves a god. We have a right to do that. I mean, our leader's gone, so let's take it upon ourselves to make this image. And, of course, Aaron fashioned that image, and all this is in Exodus 32. They took that right upon themselves and fell into idolatry. So they didn't have to do that. There's a way of escape. Look around you. Joshua is still here. God's on the mountain. Again, I relate all this back to Exodus 32, but the same thing is true for the Christian today. Whatever temptation, whatever trial, difficulty you're going through, don't think that you can conduct yourself just any old way you want to, and God will be acceptable, or God will be accepting of that. That's not how it works. It's never worked that way. And so we're going to stop at verse 13 today, but when we pick up in verse 14 tomorrow, he gets specific with something the Corinthians apparently were doing, and it has to do with idolatry and paganism. So there's a point to all of this in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, but again, all of this is connected back into chapter 8 and throughout chapter 9 and now into chapter 10. Watch how you conduct yourself. All right, guys, that's what I've got for today. Don't see any questions or comments, but I appreciate everybody being on here today. I'm glad the sound was okay. Well, I guess the plan will be back here tomorrow at 11 o'clock, and we'll pick up in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 14. So thanks for being here, and hope to see you back here tomorrow.